Welcome to Module 5 of Action Research. I hope you enjoy this week and the next couple weeks of engaging with the readings. At this point, even though we're not collecting actual data, we're analyzing actual data for a full study, right? Even though we're very much shifted into a proposal predictive nature at this point. I hope that doesn't stall your thinking when it comes to the last two sections of the action research proposal. I hope you really take on some of the appropriate nuggets for you in your study, and really enjoy thinking about possibilities, because I think this is where this gets really exciting. I'm going to try to put some energy into talking about chapters 4 and 5 and draw nuggets out of them that can be interesting and can open up options for you, because chapters 4 and 5 can present a whole lot of things, right? So before I get to that, though, I hope you've been enjoying the shout-out videos. They're certainly fun to make. Hope you've been and will continue to reach out by email with your questions about some of those final revisions that you might be making, or little tweaks, adjustments here and there on your sections, as you work toward your action research poster presentation to cap off the course. If it would be helpful to you, I'm glad to make an office phone appointment, possibly with each of you, this week, next week, if desired. Can keep the call 10 minutes, 15 minutes, can keep it nice and focused. Since I'm only teaching online, I have a very, very flexible day. Now that my kids are in so many activities, I find myself often waiting in a car for an hour or for 45 minutes, answering emails while I sit in the car. So take that as you will. The intellectual contact would be most appreciated. But if doing this would help encourage and help push your ideas along, I certainly would be glad to. Please let me know. Please reach out by email. Let me know. Don't be shy. Don't hide. Don't avoid sending me an email. Right? Conversation, especially on topics from Module 5, will really help. I do believe that. So like I said, for both these chapters this week, I've tried to organize them into the talking points, useful nuggets, insights. You'll see bold terms jumping out of the talking points at you to try to help catch your eye, help you go to what might be helpful. In the spirit of Chapter 5, I've tried to keep the qualitative and the quantitative separate, to keep that a little bit more organized. With both these chapters, ultimately, make sure that you are always considering an appropriate match of data and analysis, right? That's not to say that you can't invent some new approaches, but we don't really do that without rigorous data longitudinal study to make things like that reliable and valid. So keep that proper matching in mind, and if you have questions about it, reach out, right? So chapter 4, all about sources of inspiration for sources of data. I like thinking of it that way. Sources of inspiration for sources of data. So on the one hand, what's going on in your classroom, plus test data, big or small, that can always equal a study, right? So when you think about it, what's going on in your classroom right now, and test data, assessment data, big or small, you've always got an action research study in your classroom of some type, right? It's a question of how engaging, how interesting, how relevant is it, right? Rich conclusions in a study come from rich sources of data, so therefore you want to think about what are the richest sources of data that you have ready access to that you would want to propose in your action research proposal. So I think you'll find the chapter helpful in that sense, to see what types of further sources of data that you could include that would take you beyond just what's going on in my classroom, right? So with the previous logic of look, think, act in mind, consider first that preliminary picture or big picture. I think it's helpful that they should have called it that. Our author should have called it that. Think about the preliminary picture, the big picture, before you get focused. That's page 54. Guided conversations on page 55 with research subjects help us understand how students are experiencing classroom and school events and activities, right? Now this is going to sound a little weird, but we may know what the data we may know what the data coming from them is, right? We may know what the data is that's coming from them, but we may not know why they produce that kind of data. We may not know necessarily why is it in their nature to produce this kind of data, right? So learning a little bit more about the research subjects can maybe even help you realize, ooh, this data is actually way more important than I thought it was going to be, right? Oh, interviewing. I love interviewing. I truly believe you can't go wrong with multiple open-ended questions that promote a subject-centered discourse which reveals their thoughts and their ways of making their own meaning, right? As a constructivist, I think it makes sense that that is the type of methodology and methodological data collection tool that I would be using, right? The mini tour process they have on page 59 to 60 hints at how interviews can expand and yield an avalanche of data, sometimes too much. So you should never go into an interview without a plan, or what we would say in the research world is without a protocol, right? Or in other words, your list of questions that are approved as your research instrument, right? I'm very careful. When I use interviews, I only ask the questions that are in my protocol, but I certainly won't hesitate to kind of do a little bit of that and just act like I'm still listening, because sometimes it takes a while for subject to warm up, right? An avalanche of data, a lot of transcriptions of interviews, and a lot of transcriptions means a lot of raw data to code and search for themes and trends and patterns, right? That is what I love. Page 62, repeat interviews and extended engagement are something our author says provide opportunities to review and extend information previously acquired and suggest the need for time commitment and repeated interaction with or between research participants, right? Repeated interviews, extended engagement, it eats up time. Qualitative data collection eats up time, right? Some of the interviewing that I've done, I actually have a follow-up interview meant to happen a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, right? Because part of what I'm looking for is changing perspective over time in one particular study that I've worked with. Focus groups on page 66. Focus groups. I haven't used focus groups as a data collection tool in my time here at Arkansas State, but I did in graduate school. Focus groups may be envisioned as a group interview, but beware the dynamics, right? When you get multiple people interacting, things can get kind of crazy. A potentially rich source of data can potentially come with its own risks, right? So literature guiding focus group structure and rules and protocols for interaction is key, so that you have especially if you're doing multiple focus groups on multiple topics, right? Or imagine if you did you could do focus groups with small groups of students in your class, right? But from a standpoint of reliability and validity, you have to make sure you're doing those focus groups the same, so that any difference in what happens is because of them, the subjects, not because of you and what you asked and how you orchestrated the focus groups. Amazing. Participant observation, one of the most core types of qualitative data collection. Participant observation is in many ways a cornerstone of qualitative data collection. Page 70 says the purpose of participant observation is to familiarize researchers with the context in which issues and events are played out, or to provide participants with opportunities to stand back from their everyday involvement and watch purposefully as events unfold. Participant observation in many ways is about not altering or affecting the unfolding action, but at the same time it may not be possible to collect that data or even understand the setting without being a part of it and interacting yourself, right? So maybe to put it in a familiar context, you could, as a licensed teacher, you could observe someone else's class as a total fly on the wall, but you might not feel that you understand it as well, what's going on, unless you actually interact with that class and maybe browse around and work with some of the small groups, because that's what you're trained to do here and here, right? It's in your nature. You can do that without completely throwing the work in the classroom into chaos, because you yourself are a teacher. Well, of course, if it's your own classroom of students, you need to be there. You are a participant observer by very nature of being the teacher in that classroom. So That quote, by the way, was 39 words, and thus 1 word shy of being an APA-style block quote, for those of you keeping score. I don't know why I bothered to mention that, but I thought that would be fascinating. Artifacts, an amazing, fascinating part of data collection. Artifacts are also odd in that you don't necessarily go into a research setting with the goal of collecting artifacts, because you may not know what meaning research subjects might assign to tangible objects or products produced as a part of the action, right? Our author says their artifacts are collected according to whether or not it appears pertinent to the issue investigated. And we do not determine which artifacts are to be reviewed prior to commencement of the study. However, since their pertinence or relevance to the research question is revealed as participant perspectives emerge, right? So in other words, artifacts may become important at the time during data collection. So in other words, be on the lookout for artifacts, right? Trust your intuition. I often suggest let the research subjects guide you to the artifacts, right? If it's a tangible object that they're interacting with, right? And if it's a tangible object that contains meaning, right? Think about your classroom. Well, manipulatives. You might not take the manipulatives that are used in a math lesson, for example. You might not take those and physically put them in your research, but you could certainly take a picture and include a picture of those manipulatives as an APA-style figure or image, so that seeing and understanding the meaning, and maybe even considering the experience of being hands-on with those manipulatives might play a role in understanding the research setting or the experience of the research subjects, right? So be on the lookout for artifacts. Surveys, page 77 to 78. There's a great bulleted set of steps that spans those 2 pages for what to consider when deploying surveys. I have done surveys as well. Takes a lot of thought. And you have to be consistent. Sometimes you even have to use the same survey multiple cycles of data collection, even though you know there's a problem in it, but you can't. You have to keep the questions the same. I think surveys are a great tool. You can't go wrong with a good 1 to 5 Likert scale. 6 bullets associated with statistical data on page 79. Those are unpacked further in the quantitative section of chapter 5, by the way. The second paragraph of the selecting quantitative information section on page 81. This is a very interesting and important kind of reminder, I think, to take home. Don't simply use all of the quantitative data available, because there might be too much of it. It might not make sense. You might end up with apples and oranges. Use the relevant quantitative data, right? Be smart and be strategic in what quantitative data that you use. Reviewing the literature, page 81 to 83. Your literature review can indeed be a data set unto itself. That's a pretty awesome thing. Emergent accounts. Think of this as analysis done during data collection. Emergent accounts are not static, however, and continue to be enriched, enhanced, and clarified throughout the data collection process. That's page 83 to 84. Specifically figure 4.6 on page 84. So various types of data that I think might be, on the one hand, typical or very easy to spot in your classroom, or maybe if you look at something in a slightly different way, you might realize, ooh, one of these nuggets of types of data is right under my nose. Okay, chapter 5. The best part about chapter 5 is that you can take from chapter 5 inspiration or predictions as to your proposed methodology and data analysis, right? Some of this can be intimidating, I grant you, but on the other hand, I find it exciting because chapter 5 hints at what all you can do in the action research process and what it can unlock, right? Because ultimately, data is just data. It's just stuff piled up on our desks. If we don't do anything with it, if we don't make an effort to make meaning of it, we have nothing that will yield conclusions and useful knowledge as the fruit of the research, right? So we have to do something with the data. Chapter 5 is all about things that you can do with your data in order to extract meaning, right? So a little bit more what I mean by this. Well, to put it in perspective, first look at figure 1.5 on page 87 and compare the simplicity of that figure to figure 5.2 on page 90. One is a whole lot more complex than the other, right? For this chapter, consider some of the elements that I'm going to mention. Consider these as doors that open to you, right? Or imagine yourself having just finished collecting the data that you've proposed for your study, right? And you find yourself saying, okay, now what do I do? Right? Maybe all you need is the first step. You need to know where to begin. I think that is what I think that's what you're going to find most helpful here in chapter 5. So on the qualitative side of things, yes, the qualitative side of things. Well, first of all, the reminder on page 88, the ultimate outcome of analysis is to capture participant perspective and focus on the significant features that shape their action and behaviors, which ultimately allows us to formulate actions to resolve the problems that are the focus of the study. That's a good reminder about the ultimate purpose of why we do this, right? Okay, key experiences. Great potential, page 89 to 90. Interpretive analysis first identifies key experiences in the lives of research participants, then deconstructs or unpacks those events to reveal the features or smaller elements that comprise them, right? And one of the things that we do very often in qualitative research is we deconstruct what we find, and then in our narrative, in our analysis, we reconstruct reality, right? And how well we're able to reconstruct reality depends on the quality of the data that we deconstructed. If we can successfully reconstruct reality, we have reliability and validity. Key experiences within other data, the bottom paragraph of that one. Key experiences may also appear in representations. So in other words, the more abstract, the more artsy, the more fine art, something to consider, right? Like the quilts version of the research reports, right, that we saw before. Verbatim principle, very important. It's also important to consider, however, right? What happens when we adjust or abridge or summarize things that our research subjects say? Sometimes it serves an efficient purpose in processing data, raw data. Sometimes it might serve an agenda doing that. So in other words, we have to use the terms and concepts from participants' own talk to avoid reinterpreting, misinterpreting, or colonizing people's words, concepts, and ideas, taking them and using them for our own purposes, right? Whenever I transcribe interview data, for example, whether I transcribe it or whether I have a graduate assistant or some help me, it always has to be transcribed as precisely as possible, even if that means listening to audio over and over to make sure we got the word, even if sometimes even placing a comma in a different place, interpreting the pause in the recording sometimes can affect the meaning. So just to try to be as faithful to the research subjects as possible. I'm a firm believer in that. Remaining mindful of units of meaning will help set up analysis for success. Page 101. Isolate features and elements of experience and perspective and focus on specific details emerging from people's talk about events and experiences. But keep in mind that a unit of meaning might be a word, a phrase, or part of, or a whole sentence, right? What are the units of meaning? Knowing what your unit of meaning is. Categorizing and coding, it's essential in order to calm the choppy waters of massive qualitative data, right? Category systems divide and define our cultural words systematically, allowing us to impose a sense of order on multiple and complex phenomenon that comprise our everyday life. Fancy definition for saying when we categorize and code what we have in our qualitative data, we organize it, and it can help us pull out distinctive themes and trends that exist in the data, right? And the more clearly articulated or clearly evident that theme or trend is, the more useful it is to feed into your conclusions on the research. So on to the quantitative side of things. Statements are a type of cue to seek quantitative information or a hint that it may be the way to go. And there on page 106 had some of those. Frequency distribution on page 107. Frequency distribution is a great way at a glance to see the number of students who have scored at a specific level. Far more advantageous, I believe, than looking at scores in isolation. Frequency distribution, not done in narrative, done in table or a chart or graph form, it has a little bit more punch, I think, especially for people who are more visual, right? Measures of central tendency, I hope these are familiar concepts to you, right? Mode, medium, and mean. We should know what these are at this point, page 108 to 109. You can read up on those if you need to, but especially, I mean, they each are very different, and they can tell a different story, right? Measures of variability are a very important practice in quantitative analysis, because especially when the data set is enormous, right? The reason for these differences will not be clear. While the reason for these differences will not be clear, statistical information provides a clear picture of the degree of variation that occur, right? So in other words, we have to understand the ways in which statistical data can vary, because the data set is so big that we can't predict with 100% certainty exactly what will happen. So we need to know how much wiggle room there is, right? And what we would so in other words, standardized testing, right? Correlation versus significance, and I love what our author said. Correlation, literally, it looks like correlation, right? Versus significance. Data can be highly correlation. Two things, they work together. They rely upon each other, right? Versus significance. Significance sounds a whole lot bigger deal than it is. Well, data can be highly significant in statistical terms. In quantitative analysis, the presence of anything matters, but it can also still be very trivial. So significance, understanding how trivial something is pretty important. So with both the qualitative and the quantitative side of things, imagine how collaborative analysis on page 116 can be a game changer in the analysis process. There are some types of research data analysis that does benefit from you working with your research subjects collaboratively on it. From the conclusion, page 118, this process is ultimately one of distilling large quantities of information, revealing the central features of the issue investigated. Okay, so with our recommended article for this week, it's a review of various takes on qualitative inquiry, and ultimately it's a call to set stronger standards of evidence in qualitative inquiry. And due to the heavy load of concepts from the two chapters from our textbook, I'm gonna focus on pull-out quotes from this, right? Okay, page 25. Within disciplinary communities such as education or sociology, and across communities such as anthropology of education, scholars have a long history of disagregating and disagreeing and challenging one another on how to ensure the quality of qualitative work, and even how to catalog and categorize the various kinds of qualitative research. Their perspective, the multiple authors' perspective on this, page 25 also. We situate our response to the call for standards of evidence in qualitative research in a pervasive discourse that describes educational research in general as historically and presently broken and in need of repair. Pretty heavy, right? Page 26. Qualitative researchers have always discussed how to evaluate their science, the quality of their analysis, and theoretical interpretations of data. They disagree, however, over the terms used in these discussions: validity, reliability, rigor, and parallel terms such as trustworthiness, credibility, transferability, verisimilitude, relevance, plausibility, and confirmability. Page 27. Quality is constructed and maintained continuously throughout the life of a research project and includes decisions that researchers make as they interact with those they study and as they consider their analysis, interpretations, and representations of data. That I certainly believe. Page 28. The relationship of data and claims is demonstrated in research reports by offering adequate and appropriate information for readers to re-examine and assess a researcher's assertion and interpretation. In other words, you be transparent enough with your study that others can kind of look at your study, how you did it, and pass a judgment on you in your study, right? I think that's fair. The way claims are warranted in qualitative research typically centers on data, but researchers also use the literature relevant to studies, information collected by other scholars, and a variety of other sources to justify their claims. We mentioned before, right? Literature review can be like a data set for you. Keep in mind, this article is meant to challenge our thoughts on qualitative inquiry, right? Which is qualitative inquiry, like any other methodology, always under attack, always under revision, under scrutiny, under praise, under upgrade, right? So page 29, they say, As we suggest in the title of this article and throughout, we intend our work here to be the thoughts of one group of qualitative researchers, not an authoritative account of standards of evidence in qualitative inquiry. Page 30, what we have tried to do is justify common notions of qualitative evidence and the standards qualitative researchers use to judge whether the claims they make are warranted or justified by that evidence. And I love their final paragraph of the conclusion that they kick off with. Representing the multiple layers of human existence is fraught with challenge, alternative, and limitation. That's page 30. And then they follow up with their final word on 5 aspects of qualitative inquiry with which to continue the conversation. Okay, so to wrap this up, consider the courage that it takes to challenge an entire paradigm of inquiry, right? And quite literally tell qualitative inquiry itself, keep talking, keep churning, keep growing and changing, right? The take-home message is that qualitative inquiry as a research practice must never stagnate, and we all have a stake in continuing the motion and the flow and the currents in qualitative inquiry and keeping the conversation active about how worthwhile it is. When you consider the article in that regard, I think it is extremely powerful. Okay, so with previous weeks, additional video will follow with tips and suggestions for section 4, our section this week of the action research proposal, and another next week with section 5. I hope this a little bit longer video, but I hope it's been helpful sorting out, finding some useful nuggets within the chapters in the article. Please keep reaching out via that A-State email. Wolves up. We'll see you in the next module.